The emergency room lights were harsh, buzzing faintly as doctors rushed around the woman sprawled on the gurney. Nurses gasped, covering their mouths, some turning away with pale faces. What they found inside her body was so disturbing, so unnatural, that even seasoned surgeons whispered afterward that it was the worst thing they had ever seen. Angela Moore, 34 years old, had been brought in screaming, her hands clutching her abdomen, blood mixing with something far more revolting. She wasn't just in pain. She was living a nightmare that no one in the room could quite believe. But Angela's nightmare hadn't begun here, beneath the cold fluorescent lights of the hospital. It had begun hours earlier, in the quiet of her own bedroom, in a house that looked ordinary from the street. Angela was exhausted that night. She worked long hours at a local insurance office in Decatur, Georgia, where every day felt like a battle of paperwork and endless phone calls. By the time she came home, her body ached for nothing more than a hot shower, a glass of water, and the blissful escape of sleep. Her husband, Marcus, had been waiting. At 36, Marcus carried himself with the swagger of a man who thought the world owed him something. Once a mechanic with steady hands and a good reputation, he'd been out of work for months. His temper had grown short, his pride thinner by the day. And with that pride came something darker, a hunger for control. That evening, when Angela slid into bed and pulled the covers up to her shoulders, Marcus reached for her. His voice was low, edged with a demand. "Come here," he muttered, fingers brushing her arm. Angela shook her head gently, eyes half closed. "Not tonight, Marcus. I'm too tired." He stiffened. "Too tired." His tone sharpened, the edge of a blade beneath the words. Angela turned to face him, her brown eyes pleading. "It's just one night. Please, I need to rest." Silence hung heavy between them. Marcus's jaw tightened, his chest rising and falling faster than before. To most men, it would have been a small thing, a simple rejection after a long day. But to Marcus, whose ego had been bleeding for months, it was salt in a deep wound. He rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling, his fists clenched under the blanket. A wife doesn't tell her husband no, he thought bitterly. Not if she respects him, not if she loves him. Beside him, Angela's breathing slowed, drifting towards sleep. But Marcus's eyes stayed wide open, burning in the dark. The fan spun overhead, rattling faintly, but all he heard was the echo of her refusal. "Too tired," he whispered to himself, the words dripping with resentment. That whisper grew into a thought, and the thought hardened into a plan. By the time the clock on the nightstand ticked past midnight, Marcus's mind was already far from rest. His pride was wounded, his masculinity threatened. And Marcus Moore was not a man who handled threats with grace. He slid quietly out of bed, grabbing his keys from the dresser. Angela didn't stir. He stood there for a long moment, watching her chest rise and fall, and something cold flickered across his face. Then, without a word, he walked out into the night, shutting the door behind him. It was just one refusal, one tired whisper from a wife to her husband. But in Marcus's mind, it had been more than that. It had been humiliation. And that single word, no, would set in motion a chain of events so horrifying, so unthinkable, that by sunrise, Angela's life would never be the same. The streets of Decatur were quiet after midnight. The kind of quiet that made the neon glow of a roadside bar seem like the only living thing for miles. Marcus's car rumbled into the cracked parking lot, headlights cutting across a row of dented trucks and beat-up sedans. Inside, the bar smelled of stale beer and smoke. Ceiling fans creaked as they pushed humid air in lazy circles. This was Marcus's haunt, a place where men with too much anger and too little purpose drowned their bitterness in cheap whiskey. He slid onto a stool, signaling to the bartender without a word. A glass clinked down in front of him, amber liquid sloshing as he brought it to his lips. He drank hard, the burn crawling down his throat, but it didn't put out the fire gnawing inside him. "Rough night," a voice drawled beside him. Marcus turned. It was Earl Johnson, a man he'd known for years. Earl worked odd jobs, most recently pest control. His teeth were yellow, his laugh always a little too loud. And he had a reputation for cruelty, the kind of man who found joy in watching weaker things squirm. Marcus grunted. "She turned me down, just laid there, and said she was too tired." Earl smirked, leaning back on his stool. "Women forget their place sometimes." Marcus slammed the glass on the bar. "She humiliated me, Earl. I'm her damn husband. She doesn't get to say no to me. The bartender glanced their way, but said nothing. Men like Marcus and Earl weren't the kind you interrupted. Earl's eyes narrowed, glittering with something mean. You want her to remember who runs that house? I got something for you. Marcus frowned. What the hell are you talking about? Earl chuckled, reaching under the bar stool where he'd left a duffel bag. He pulled out a glass jar, its lid screwed tight. Inside, the shadows shifted. The longer Marcus stared, the clearer it became. Legs, antennae, bodies crawling over one another in a frenzy. Cockroaches. Dozens of them. Marcus recoiled, his lip curling. The hell is that? Earl leaned in, lowering his voice like he was offering a sacred secret. Fear. Pure fear in a jar. You want to teach her a lesson? This'll do it. Nothing on this earth makes the skin crawl like these bastards. Marcus shook his head, unsettled. You're out of your damn mind. But Earl only laughed, a raspy sound that carried through the bar. Ain't about killing her. It's about control. You put these where she least expects, and she'll never forget. She'll think twice before she tells you no again. Marcus stared at the jar. The roaches scratched and scuttled against the glass, desperate for release. For a moment, he thought of Angela asleep at home, her hair splayed across the pillow, the softness of her breath. But then the memory of her words came back, sharp and humiliating. I'm too tired. He grabbed the jar. Earl grinned, slapping him on the back. That's the spirit. You'll see. After this, she'll never cross you again. Marcus left the bar with the jar tucked under his arm. The night air was heavy, buzzing with cicadas. He slid into his car, setting the glass container on the passenger seat. The insects clawed against the sides, their tiny bodies writhing. As the engine roared to life, Marcus muttered to himself, almost convincing himself it was justified. She made me do this. She brought this on herself. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and empty roads. Each mile tightened the knot in his chest. There was still time to stop, to toss the jar into the ditch and pretend this night had never happened. But Marcus's pride was louder than reason, heavier than conscience. By the time he pulled into the driveway, his hands trembled with anticipation. The house loomed dark and silent, every window glowing faintly with moonlight. Angela was still asleep, unaware of the storm walking through her front door. Marcus picked up the jar, feeling the vibration of hundreds of legs scratching inside. He carried it up the steps, his breath shallow, his heart pounding like a war drum. At the bedroom door, he paused. Angela's soft breathing drifted out, peaceful, trusting. For a fleeting second, something human flickered across his face. Hesitation, maybe even guilt. But it vanished as quickly as it came. His grip on the jar tightened. Marcus whispered into the dark, "She'll never say no again." And with that, he stepped inside. The bedroom was silent except for the steady hum of the old ceiling fan. The air was thick, humid, the kind of southern night that clung to your skin. Angela lay curled on her side, lost in the heavy rhythm of sleep, unaware that her husband had returned from the bar carrying a jar of pure terror. Marcus closed the door quietly behind him. He stood in the shadows for a long moment, just watching her. She looked so peaceful, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her hand resting gently against her cheek. For a split second, something inside him softened. He remembered their wedding day, the way she'd smiled nervously when she said, "I do." But then the memory of her voice earlier that night pierced through. "Not tonight, Marcus. I'm too tired." His jaw tightened. That wasn't the voice of a devoted wife, he told himself. That was rejection, humiliation. And in Marcus Moore's world, humiliation demanded punishment. He set the jar on the nightstand. The scratching inside was faint but constant, a sinister whisper. He twisted the lid slowly, the faint pop of air escaping louder than he expected. His heart pounded, his palms slick. "Time to teach you," he muttered under his breath. One by one, the cockroaches crawled out, their long antennae twitching as they scurried into the folds of the blanket. Marcus tilted the jar further, watching them tumble onto the sheets, their bodies scattering across the bed. Some crawled up Angela's nightgown. One disappeared beneath the covers. Angela stirred slightly, her brow furrowing, but she didn't wake. Marcus's breathing grew heavy, his eyes fixed with cruel fascination. He pulled the blanket back slowly, just enough to guide the roaches closer to her bare skin. They explored her thighs, her stomach, the warm softness of her body. He whispered, almost gleeful, "How do you like that, baby? Still too tired for me now?" A roach vanished beneath the hem of her gown, then another. Marcus watched, captivated by his own wickedness. It was no longer just about revenge. It was about power, about controlling the most intimate part of her without her knowledge, without her consent. Angela shifted again, mumbling faintly in her sleep. She brushed at her leg, half dreaming, before rolling over. Marcus froze, heart hammering, afraid she might wake and discover him. But she settled again, sinking deeper into unconsciousness. He released the last of the insects and quietly screwed the lid back onto the empty jar. He set it on the dresser like a trophy, pride swelling in his chest. He climbed into bed beside her, staring into the dark, a grim smile stretching across his face. For Marcus, this was victory. She might never know exactly what he'd done, but she would feel it. She would wake to discomfort, to fear she couldn't explain, and he would know the truth, that her body had been invaded under his control. He turned onto his back, whispering to the ceiling fan spinning above. "That'll teach you. That'll remind you who you belong to." Hours passed. The night deepened. Angela's dreams twisted into restlessness. She shifted again, her breathing uneven. A soft moan slipped from her lips, one of unease, not pleasure. Her body tensed, her hands gripping the sheets, as if her subconscious knew something was terribly wrong. Marcus lay awake, listening. He found a sick kind of satisfaction in her tossing and turning. At one point she whimpered, clawing lightly at her stomach, and he smirked in the dark. "Good," he whispered. "Good. Let it sink in." The insects did their work in silence, crawling deeper, scratching, leaving tiny wounds invisible to the eye, but impossible for the body to ignore. By the time the first faint glow of dawn crept through the blinds, Marcus finally drifted into a shallow sleep. Angela, meanwhile, stirred violently, her body convulsing as if fighting something unseen. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion flooding them. At first, she thought it was just a nightmare, the feeling of something crawling, biting, tearing inside her. But the pain was sharp, real. She sat up with a gasp, clutching her abdomen. The world around her swam as she stumbled out of bed, feet tangling in the sheets, nearly falling before she caught herself. Marcus barely stirred, mumbling in his sleep, oblivious to her agony. Angela staggered toward the bathroom, each step fueled by terror she couldn't yet name. She flicked on the harsh light and lifted her nightgown. What she saw made her blood run cold. Something moved, something alive. Her scream tore through the house, shattering the fragile morning silence. And in the bedroom, Marcus opened his eyes, smiling in the dark. The scream that ripped from Angela's throat was not just loud. It was primal, raw, a sound dragged from the deepest pit of terror. It shook the walls of the modest house, spilling out into the quiet neighborhood where early risers paused in their morning routines, coffee cups trembling in their hands. Angela clutched the bathroom sink, her knuckles white as porcelain. The harsh overhead light revealed the unthinkable. Cockroaches, large, writhing, very much alive, were crawling against her inner thighs, forcing their way out, leaving trails of blood and filth. Some fell onto the tile floor, skittering toward the shadows. Her body convulsed with horror. She slapped at her skin, sobbing, her breath hitching in ragged gasps. "No, no, 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 God, please no," she cried, her voice breaking. Her reflection in the mirror was a stranger, eyes wide with madness, hair plastered to her damp face, sweat pouring down her temples. From the bedroom, Marcus leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching. His expression was not of shock, not of guilt, but of grim satisfaction. Angela saw him in the mirror's reflection. Her voice cracked with disbelief. "What did you do to me?" Marcus tilted his head, his tone calm, chilling. "Just teaching you a lesson, Angie. You don't tell me no." Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, curling in on herself. The insects writhed, and she screamed again, clawing at her own skin as if she could tear the nightmare away. "Please," she begged, tears mixing with sweat. "Call someone, help me." But Marcus only shrugged, his eyes cold. "Help? You didn't want me last night, but now you want me to save you? Maybe now you'll remember who's in charge." Angela's cries grew louder, so piercing that the sound carried beyond the thin walls. Across the street, Mrs. Franklin, a 70-year-old widow, froze mid-step on her porch. She had lived next door for 20 years and had heard arguments, the slamming of doors, but nothing like this. That scream, raw and desperate, made the hair on her arms stand up. She shuffled inside, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911 with trembling hands. This is my neighbor," she stammered to the dispatcher. "Something's happening. She's screaming, begging for help. Please send someone quick." Inside the bathroom, Angela was fading. Her sobs turned to guttural wails as she rocked back and forth, arms wrapped around her stomach. The pain was unbearable, but worse was the violation, the knowledge that this hadn't been an accident, that the man she loved, the man she trusted, had done this to her. She looked up at Marcus, eyes bloodshot and swollen. You're a monster," she whispered. Marcus sneered, stepping closer. He crouched down, meeting her at eye level. "No, baby. I'm your husband. And you're mine." Angela recoiled as he brushed a finger against her cheek. His touch felt like acid, burning deeper than the insects that ravaged her. She slapped his hand away with the last of her strength, collapsing against the cold tile. The wail of sirens cut through the air minutes later, growing louder until red and blue lights flooded the small street. Angela's screams had already begun to weaken, her voice hoarse, her body trembling in shock. 2 officers pounded on the front door. Marcus straightened, his heart hammering. For a split second, he considered hiding the evidence, the empty jar on the dresser, the insects still crawling across the sheets. But the pounding grew louder, and a commanding voice shouted, "Police! Open up!" Angela managed one last cry, hoarse but clear. "Help me!" That was enough. The officers kicked the door open. Guns drawn, they stormed the hallway, their eyes widening at the sight of Angela sprawled on the bathroom floor, bloodied and covered in crawling insects. One officer dropped to his knees, immediately calling for paramedics over the radio. "Ma'am, hold on. We've got you." Angela's eyes fluttered, brimming with tears of relief. "Please, don't let me die," she rasped. Behind them, Marcus raised his hands, feigning innocence. "I didn't touch her. I don't know what happened." But his act was paper thin. The jar sat in plain view on the dresser, its glass smeared, lid loosely screwed back on. An officer spotted it instantly. "What the hell is that?" the officer muttered, picking it up. The movement inside was undeniable, the few remaining cockroaches scurrying against the glass. Marcus's face drained of color. "Sir," the officer barked, "you're under arrest." As paramedics lifted Angela onto a stretcher, she clutched weakly at the hand of the female medic beside her. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "He did this to my husband. He put them inside me." The medic squeezed her hand gently, voice firm. "You're safe now. We've got you." The image burned itself into the memory of every first responder that day. A woman broken but still fighting, a man led away in cuffs with no remorse in his eyes, and the haunting reminder of how cruelty can hide behind the walls of any home. The sliding doors of the emergency room burst open as paramedics wheeled Angela in, her body trembling under the harsh fluorescent lights. The gurney rattled across the linoleum, every bump pulling a moan of pain from her throat. 34-year-old female, severe abdominal trauma, infestation, possible foreign bodies. One paramedic shouted, his voice tight with urgency. Doctors and nurses swarmed. They'd seen shootings, stabbings, overdoses, but this was different. The sight made even hardened professionals recoil. One nurse gagged behind her mask when she pulled back the sheet and saw the movement on Angela's thighs. "Dear God," whispered Dr. Kelly, the attending physician. "Get me suction and gloves, triple gloves." Angela's screams were fading into hoarse sobs, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Get them out," she pleaded, grabbing at Dr. Kelly's coat. "Please, just get them out of me." The doctor leaned close, his tone calm but urgent. "Angela, listen to me. We're going to take care of you. Just breathe. You're safe now." But she didn't feel safe. Not yet. Not while she could still feel them crawling. The medical team worked frantically. Forceps, saline, suction, every tool became a weapon against the invasion inside her. Nurses shouted counts as they removed insect after insect, dropping each into a biohazard tray. The sound of them hitting the metal pan was enough to make one orderly step back, his face pale. 3 out. 4. 5. By the time they reached double digits, The room was silent except for the mechanical hum of the suction machine and Angela's broken sobs. Lacerations in the vaginal canal, a nurse reported grimly. We need antibiotics immediately. She's losing blood. Dr. Kelly nodded, sweat beading on his forehead. Stabilize her. And keep going until we're sure there's nothing left. Angela turned her head weakly on the pillow, her tear-filled eyes meeting the fluorescent light above. The betrayal, the humiliation, the agony, it all crashed over her in waves. My husband, she whispered, her voice almost gone. He did this to me. A detective, standing just outside the curtain, scribbled furiously into his notebook. Every word mattered now. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in a holding cell just a few blocks away, his hands still smelling faintly of whiskey and sweat. He tried to tell officers it wasn't his fault, that Angela was imagining things, but the evidence told another story. Back at the hospital, Angela's body began to calm under the cocktail of medications. The nurses worked with gentle precision, treating wounds that should never have existed. One nurse brushed back Angela's damp hair, whispering, "You're strong. You're going to get through this." Angela's lips trembled. "I don't feel strong. I feel ruined." Her words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. No one in the room dared to answer. Because in that moment, everyone knew, whatever physical scars healed, Angela Moore would carry this night inside her forever. The holding cell smelled of sweat and metal. Marcus sat slouched on the bench, his hands cuffed in front of him, eyes fixed on the floor. Hours had passed since the police pulled him from his house, yet his arrogance hadn't faded. In his mind, he was still in control. Detective Samuel Ortiz entered the room, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a gaze that cut through excuses like glass. He set a thin folder on the table, took his seat across from Marcus, and studied him for a long, silent moment. Marcus shifted, smirking. "So what's this, detective? You dragged me down here 'cause my wife had a breakdown? She's always been dramatic." Ortiz didn't flinch. He opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. Angela on the hospital gurney, her face contorted in pain, her body covered with a white sheet stained red. "Does that look like drama to you?" Ortiz asked, his voice calm, deliberate. Marcus's smirk faltered, but only for a second. "I don't know what you want me to say. She probably got into something on her own. Bugs, maybe. We live in Georgia. Roaches are everywhere." Ortiz leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Angela told us what you did, and we found the jar in your bedroom. Do you really think this story about wild roaches wandering into her body is going to save you?" The words hit Marcus like a slap. His jaw tightened, his eyes darting away. He chuckled nervously, shaking his head. "You're twisting things. I'd never hurt her. She's my wife." Ortiz's gaze never left him. "Your wife begged for her life this morning. She screamed loud enough that neighbors called 911. She's telling doctors you did this. So help me understand. Marcus, what does marriage mean to you?" Silence stretched between them. Marcus drummed his fingers on the table, his bravado cracking. He tried again. "It wasn't supposed to. It wasn't supposed to go that far." Ortiz pounced. "So you admit it." Marcus froze. His breath came faster, his words spilling out like a dam breaking. "She humiliated me, all right? She turned me down. I'm her husband, and she turned me down like I was nothing. Like I wasn't even a man." Ortiz let the silence drag again, letting Marcus hear his own words echo. Then, softly, he asked, "And that's what made you pour a jar of cockroaches on your wife? Because she said no?" Marcus slammed his cuffed fists on the table. "You don't get it. A man has to have respect in his own house. She made me feel small. I wanted her to remember who I am." The detective's voice hardened. "So you invaded her body. You tortured her. You treated her like she was property, like she was less than human." Marcus's eyes burned with something between rage and shame. "I just wanted her scared, that's all. I didn't want her dead. I just wanted her to never forget." Ortiz leaned back in his chair, disgust plain on his face. He closed the folder and stood. "Oh, she'll never forget, Marcus. And neither will a jury." The steel door clanged open. Two uniformed officers stepped in, ready to escort Marcus back to his cell. He tried to stand tall, to keep the swagger in his stride, but his shoulders sagged under the weight of his own confession. As the door slammed shut behind him, Detective Ortiz exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his weary face. He had heard many confessions in his career, But this one lingered, heavy and vile. Because Marcus Moore hadn't just committed an act of violence. He had committed an act of domination so twisted, so intimate, it stripped his victim of her very sense of self. And now, there was no denying it. Marcus's own words had sealed his fate. The courthouse in downtown Decatur buzzed with whispers the morning Marcus Moore's trial began. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing as spectators filed inside. The crime had rattled the community. Neighbors who once thought Marcus and Angela were an ordinary couple now sat in disbelief, waiting to hear how cruelty could take root behind closed doors. Inside the courtroom, Angela sat at the prosecution's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Months of recovery had left her physically stronger, but the haunted look in her eyes betrayed wounds that hadn't healed. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back. She wasn't there for spectacle. She was there for justice. When Marcus was led in wearing a wrinkled suit, the room fell silent. He avoided Angela's gaze, jaw clenched, trying to project confidence. But the clinking of his shackles against the floor betrayed the truth. He was no longer in control. Judge Harris, a stern man with gray hair and a gravelly voice, called the court to order. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Claire Benson, rose first. Her words cut like steel. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a case about marital disagreement. This is a case about domination, humiliation, and deliberate cruelty. Marcus Moore didn't simply lose his temper. He planned an act of torture. He used living creatures to invade his wife's body, an act so vile, so unimaginable, that it shocked even seasoned doctors. Angela Moore trusted her husband, and he betrayed her in the most intimate way possible. Marcus's defense attorney, David Carter, tried to counter, painting Marcus as a man who made a terrible mistake under the influence of alcohol. My client never intended to cause permanent harm, he argued. This was a misguided attempt to get attention from his wife, not a calculated plan to destroy her. But the evidence was damning. The jar of cockroaches. The testimony of neighbors who heard Angela's screams. The doctors who described, in grim detail, what they found in the ER. And, above all, Angela herself. When she took the stand, the room held its breath. Her voice shook at first, but as she continued, strength replaced fear. He stood there while I begged him, she said, eyes locked on Marcus. I screamed for help, and he told me it was a lesson. He didn't just hurt me. He stripped away my dignity, my sense of safety in my own home. I will carry that night with me for the rest of my life. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't falter. Her words pierced the jury's hearts. Some leaned forward, visibly shaken. Even the judge adjusted his glasses, his stern expression softening for a moment. The prosecutor seized the momentum. This was not a prank. This was not a mistake. This was an act of control, an act of power, designed to remind Angela Moore that in her husband's eyes, she was property, not a person. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is criminal. When it came time for the defense to cross-examine, Marcus stared at his wife, lips curling into a faint sneer. His attorney asked gently, Angela, is it possible Marcus only meant to frighten you, not to truly harm you? Angela's answer was sharp, unwavering. When you put something living inside someone against their will, that is harm. That is violence. No matter what excuse he gives, he knew what he was doing. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Harris struck his gavel, restoring order. Closing arguments sealed Marcus's fate. The prosecution painted him as a man who let his ego curdle into sadism. The defense's plea for leniency rang hollow in the shadow of Angela's pain. When the jury returned, their verdict was swift, guilty on all counts, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and spousal abuse. Marcus's face drained of color as the words echoed through the room. Angela closed her eyes, tears falling silently, not of grief, but of relief. Judge Harris leaned forward, voice firm. Marcus Moore, your actions were calculated, cruel, and inhuman. This court sentences you to 20 years in state prison. The gavel struck. The trial was over. Angela exhaled, clutching her attorney's hand. Justice had been served, but the scars would remain. The trial ended, but for Angela Moore, the echoes of that night lingered. Even months later, sleep came only in fragments, interrupted by phantom sensations crawling across her skin. The doctors told her the wounds would heal. What they couldn't promise was how long it would take for the nightmares to fade. Angela moved out of the small house she once shared with Marcus. She couldn't bear the sight of the bedroom where he had stood in the shadows, or the bathroom where she had discovered the horror inside her own body. She packed what little she could salvage and left, vowing never to look back. In her new apartment, the walls were quiet, and the silence felt different, peaceful instead of dangerous. She began therapy, speaking words she had once been too ashamed to say. Each session peeled back a layer of fear, replacing it slowly with strength. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was learning to reclaim her life. The community of Decatur was shaken. Neighbors who had once waved politely now whispered in shock at the cruelty hidden behind Angela's closed doors. Churches held vigils for her recovery. Women came forward to share their own stories of abuse, saying Angela's courage gave them the strength to seek help. Marcus, meanwhile, was transferred to state prison. His name appeared in headlines, not as a man, but as a warning, how pride and entitlement could twist into something monstrous. He would spend 2 decades behind bars, and even that felt like a pale shadow compared to the sentence Angela carried in her heart. On the anniversary of the verdict, Angela stood on the steps of the courthouse where she had once trembled under cross-examination. This time, her hands were steady. Speaking to a small crowd of reporters and advocates, she said simply, "Respect isn't something you take. Love isn't something you force. If someone believes they own you, they don't love you. They destroy you. And I will not be destroyed." Her voice didn't shake. Her words cut through the crisp autumn air, a declaration that what had been done to her would not define her. And in that moment, Angela Moore was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor, a voice, a warning.